Hello. Today we're able to participate in a conversation between Krishnaj Gourab, Joe Mercado, and myself with Isaac Vetter from the Epic Corporation in Verona, Wisconsin. The conversation revolved around Interoperable Clinical Decision Support, or CDS. Isaac is a longtime member of the FIRE committees, including co-author of CDS Hooks. Isaac describes himself as someone who works with tools and standards so that he can help other developers to build applications to work with EHR data. And let's join our conversation in progress.
We all know the advantages of clinical decision support at the point of care for the patients. But what is the added advantage of having interoperable CDS riding on a CDS hook so that we can trigger it in appropriate place in the clinical workflow? So what are the advantages? Why we should look at it?
Right. And I think you're right. There is a lot of clinical decision support that can be delivered just within within that native system that the clinician is using. I think that the opportunities for interoperable clinical decision support most obviously come about when all of the data or the algorithm or the model that you need in order to generate that guidance at the point of care, generate that guidance to the clinician, don't exist within your kind of local EHR or your local CPOE type system. So a couple of examples of that. For a long time, a good example of that was genomics knowledge bases, especially in the cases where those are these like giant, databases, or even sometimes even third-party lab databases that you want to inject pharmacogenomics CDS into the ordering, into the prescribing workflow. It's really becomes necessary to reach out to that external system and integrate that data into the EHR that the clinician is using to order. I think that PGX and genomics knowledge bases are kind of one example, but really it's anytime you have some resource that you need to generate your guidance that lives external to your local system.
That is such an excellent use case, because there's like, otherwise we are now compelled to create all of these data streams in-house if we don't want to hit something that's outside our ecosystem. And the other thing that this is relatively recent, so the measles is on the rise again. So recently I got a letter, a PDF from our health department for screening of measles. And whenever I get these kind of letters, which I have to remember now, it always strikes my mind that can we have an ecosystem where, let's say that a clinical decision support is created somewhere, and using CDS hooks, it becomes automatically deployable within my EMR.
Yeah.
So, but have you seen adoption of CDS hooks and interoperable EMRs generally rise, or are people waking up to this more now?
And yeah, that's a great question. And so I think we made our first publication of the CDS hooks FHIR standard maybe in the late teens. I think it was something like 2018, 2019. And since then, we kind of saw adoption grow pretty slowly. I think we had a few EHRs, including some specialty EHRs, kind of do early kind of partial or incremental adoption of CDS hooks. That's kind of slowly grown over time, and I think that increasingly we're now at a little bit of a turning spot where we're starting to see kind of production acceleration, and use cases really begin to be more common. I mean, I specifically am at Epic, an EHR company. For the data that I have access to, I'm able to see that across the Epic community, across the set of organizations that use Epic as their EHR, we're up to something like 500 million CDS hooks API calls annually. So in 2024, we saw something like 600 million API calls. And but that's also maybe just a quarter or a third or so of the organizations that do use CDS hooks have one or more CDS hooks integration in production. And we're actually anticipating that that's going to increase, maybe even double over the course of 2025. So I think it's a slow and gradual thing. I think you need health systems and you need these third-party developers who are just trying to create a product that helps their customers. like see and then test and find value in that interoperability, and sometimes that can just take a little bit of time. I think it's also worth pointing out that unlike a lot of the other fire kind of technologies, there hasn't really been a regulatory driver for CDS hooks, which honestly is kind of, I think it's really exciting that even without that regulatory driver, like we're seeing fire be successful. I think that really speaks to the kind of convenience and ease of use and power of the fire community overall.
Isaac, the numbers are pretty crazy in a good way, but how do we get to that next step where it's 50% of the Epic community or 75%? And I guess the question behind that is, you've seen it grow pretty modestly, but what do you think the reasons are that it is growing? Is there a particular type of CDS that is gaining a little bit more traction? You mentioned the genomics, and that's super complicated. That's beyond my understanding, to be frank, but there's got to be more simpler types of CDS that I think are probably increasing the adoption.
And one of the use cases that we kind of targeted all the way back in the day, there was even an Argonaut project around, was this kind of CMS, initially a CMS driven use case, where CMS had a goal of ensuring that specific types of like high cost radiology orders were evaluated for clinical appropriateness at the moment of ordering. And so at one point there was actually only a few dozen kind of CMS certified, I'm not sure I'm using the right words, but CMS approved decision support vendors that could generate these appropriateness scores for radiology ordering. And that was a very, very natural, even necessary use case for interoperable CDS, because we had a small number of kind of external like decision support vendors that were approved for generating and delivering these appropriateness scores. And of course, as a prescriber, you as an orderer, as a placer, you want to see that appropriateness score when you're ordering, so that you have the opportunity to kind of react to it and adjust your order appropriately. And so I think that was initially like a really big driver for some of the concept of interoperable CDS. Since then, so I think we're increasingly seeing more and more of those radiology appropriateness ordering decision support vendors kind of adopt CDS hooks. We've even seen them expand a little bit into other types of high value ordering. So for example, off the top of my head, I know of at least one or so products that are based around lab ordering. I think another use case that we're actually seeing driving CDS hooks is actually a payer use case. So instead of clinical decision support, the Da Vinci coverage requirements discovery project and specification actually kind of and uses CDS hooks for like an administrative decision support workflow, where the provider can, during the process of ordering, a provider system can call out to a payer, and that payer can say, this order will be covered, or more information is needed to determine whether or not this order will be covered.
I imagine some of that might extend to, just as we think about care gap closure, quality measures, things like that. If you're already doing the enrollment of like, hey, this patient is enrolled in this plan, like they have a care gap, I imagine at some point that's going to be integrated if it's not already too.
Yeah, and care gap integrations are important, and I think a big focus as part of that community right now.
And we're seeing a lot on the appropriateness as well. So it's good to know that different sides of healthcare are synergistic. One more question is, as we think about students and sort of our class, do you have any recommendations on what they should do or think about doing at their own organization to adopt CDS if they haven't yet? What are the things, and how do they kind of approach that conversation internally?
I mean, I think that as the traditional and stereotypical answer is like, oh, you should put that in your RFPs. And there's some truth to that. Like, if you want interoperable software, also, but I think in terms of informaticists, I think as informaticists are looking to conduct research and deploy research and improve the practice of healthcare, at the moment of care, the boots on the ground, I think keep CDS hooks, keep interoperable decision support as one of those tools in your toolkit, along with all of the other kind of EHR integration or EHR like build options and configurations and tools that you have available to you.
I like the idea of the sort of the slow adoption. I think people are starting to understand that it's not so scary, right? Another acronym in healthcare we don't understand. So how do we get to that point? And I think the students in this class are going to learn a little bit more about how it isn't as scary as they might think it is.
Yeah, and shout out to the students and you guys for such a great class and class series. I'm always really impressed with the caliber of your students.
Thank you.
We're pretty happy with them too. So I'm going to a little bit higher level question first, first of two. So, there's a lot of changes going on in the world right now, and there's a lot of different standards. And so one of the running jokes in standards committees is, which standard, there's so many to choose from. From what you've seen in industry and from what you've seen over the last, even decade, how do you feel in terms of FHIR as solidifying its base within the interoperable healthcare space, and then CDS hooks solidifying its space within the external clinical decision support algorithms?
Right. I am not just FHIR. I'm not one of the rabid FHIR fans. I think that there are other interoperable standards that we have in production as a health IT community are good in that especially in that they are in production. I mean, the best interoperable standard you can have is the one that you're actually using to do interoperability. And so I'm one of the last people in the world that'll say like, oh, we should, replace that with FHIR. I think that we should be strict. We have a limited amount of resources in healthcare, and continue, and that trend is continuing. And we should be kind of careful and make sure that we're and selective and strategic, and make sure that we're using kind of the best interoperability technology for our need and for our use case. I think that FHIR has really delivered something novel in terms of its use of RESTful APIs, modern web security, use of modern web API technology. I even heard Graham Grieve, the father of FHIR, once said, with FHIR, we just kind of rode the Web 2.0 wave. That's why FHIR is successful. And I think that was maybe he said that maybe 5 or 6 years ago is when I heard him say that in a small group. But it's always kind of struck with me like, oh yeah. And then because of the community, because of all the work that's gone into creating the data model, because of the work that's gone into creating profiles for specific use cases, I think that we've seen FHIR be consistently be successful. So right now we've got this real strong beachhead with FHIR in terms of patient access, right? Which patient access APIs we had a little bit with CDA, but like not really. I mean, and so that's practically a novel use case, at least in the US, but elsewhere too. So I think we've been really successful there. And then I think that over time, what we're going to see is kind of ongoing increases in other use cases that aren't really interoperable or being met well with existing interoperability technology. I think a couple of examples of that are payer-provider integrations, like I alluded to with that coverage requirements discovery. I think we're seeing a lot of FHIR come in, especially in the US, and enable more data exchange between payers and providers. Prior authorization is a very expensive, wasteful process in the United States. Lots of other opportunities for improvement. But then even things like even ordering and resulting, I think over time we will see FHIR kind of creep in and enable smoother and improved integrations, even in places where we have some of these older standards like the currently dominant. I would also say that I think we would be doing a disservice to think about FHIR only in the context of the United States. I think the US has done a really admirable job, leading the world in terms of FHIR adoption and usage. However, we see a number of countries that have taken the best parts of what the US has done with FHIR, and are replicating it for their own nation, for their own, jurisdiction and societies. I think a couple of examples of that are Australia. They've created a national fire accelerator program. Canada is doing really, really great work. I think the UK is doing some good work. Netherlands honestly has kind of rivaled the US, or maybe even exceeded, in terms of their usage and use of fire. And then I'd also be remiss not to say the EU. The EU recently, last month, passed some legislation, I guess, called the European Health Data Space, that kind of has prioritized a set of cross-member state interoperability use cases that they intend to kind of pretty explicitly use fire to accomplish. So there's really exciting stuff happening all around the globe in terms of fire. And then you also asked specifically about CDS hooks as we've seen it kind of grow and mature and provide an increasing amount of value, I think, to health systems and CDS developers. Big picture is so CDS hooks uses fire as its underlying interoperable data model, and CDS hooks really is the method for accomplishing remote decision support within fire and within the fire community. I think we've been an important part of the fire community, and that overall kind of breadth of fire solutions to real world problems that fire solves for a long time. I think over time we'll continue to see increases in the usage of CDS hooks, and that's because there haven't really been successful remote CDS hooks standards before CDS hooks. And that's a little bit controversial. There have been remote CDS standards. I think like IHE has had some, and then there's also many kind of vendor specific specifications for accomplishing remote real-time clinical decision support. And we're seeing CDS hooks start to kind of eat away at some of those vendor-specific integrations and those vendor-specific technologies, as we not only hit feature parity with some of those vendor-specific technologies, but also then begin to exceed them. And I think that one of the benefits is a lot of times a standard moves slower than something that a vendor can just put together really quick and push out the door, but it goes farther. And often is higher quality because there's more eyes on it. There's more thought. There's more diverse viewpoints that go into the creation and maintenance and enhancements of an industry standard. And so over time, when you support standards, you see more benefit over the long term. And I think that's exactly what we'll increasingly see vendors will realize and understand and begin to benefit from themselves as we continue to see adoption increases for CDS hooks specifically.
Isaac, that's super interesting. And you brought up the whole idea of payers and providers exchanging data via fire. And so one example of that would be Blue Button, right? CMS, largest payer. Do you think, and that's mandated, right? Obviously through legislature for like ONC, ASTP, through some of the like the ACO programs, things like that. Maybe not mandated, but encouraged. Do you realistically see a world where CDS hooks will also be a part of some of that new policy? Maybe not now, maybe not. At some point in the future, do you think there's going to be a world where that's going to be a part of it, or maybe just the fact that everybody's already using fire and it's sort of the natural extension to do clinical decision support, we're just going to do that way?
Yeah, I mean, a great question. Let me the magic ball or the crystal ball. But no, that's a great question. I mean, like we did see ASTP, ONC they've had a couple of requests for information as part of draft rules where they ask the community, hey, should we consider, or how could we encourage CDS hooks adoption? I think it was kind of the underlying message that I heard. And including, they actually had a really mature proposal in their draft HTI2 rule. HTI2 didn't really quite get published as the draft HTI2 rule as is did not at all get published. Instead, when it came out, it was more about a few other important interoperability things that ONC was pushing forward. But I think the writing's pretty clear there from ONC that like eventually, at some point, as long as they stay on the trajectory that they've been on for the past 5-10 years, that I think that they do want to take successes from the fire community, and they want to spread those successes across health IT nationally. And as CDS Hooks becomes, it is successful because it has production implementations, because it's a kind of mature specification created by the community in a consensus-based way. They look for opportunities to kind of promote those across the entire nation. So I would expect that eventually, I think that we saw a little bit of disruption, I think, with how HTI2 kind of got split up into a few different rules, and I think they prioritized specific things as part of the administration change. But
that's a really good point. I hadn't actually read HTI2 in a long time, so thank you for that reminder. Terry, maybe we can grab that for students and call out some of those passages so they can get a sense for kind of the idea how the rule becomes a law. It doesn't always work, but I think that'd be interesting to call out for students too.
I would like to reiterate one thing that I've told a couple of ONC folks, I think, who were helped author that part of that rule. I think they really did do a great job. It can be hard for government regulators to also be technical experts. I find mistakes in draft rules all the time. I mean, like technical mistakes, right? Like, oh, they clearly didn't understand how this part of this one edge case for fire works. But they really nailed the CDS Hooks proposal. I thought it was thoughtful. It was accurate. It was targeted. It was really well done.
So, as someone who did not read this particular development of the legislation, did they approach it by use case? How did they approach it? No.
They did not approach which because like, well, what is the use case? And that was
right.
And it seems. Rather, they approached it. They defined a few generic capabilities that they said that they were proposing that they require EHRs to support. Specifically, it was 3 hooks. I think it was 3 hooks. It was just the ones that were documented and published by HL7 as those that are most mature based upon HL7's evaluation of their usage. And then a few other capabilities were things like the ability to send a request, get back a response, display a card, launch a smart app. And I think maybe those were kind of like the big required capabilities. And they did not specify a use case. And I think that my guess is that, maybe defining that kind of infrastructural capabilities, then they would look for and identify use cases kind of to build on top of that over time.
So I'm just looking at the HL7 website, but the 3 most common ones, according to the HL7 website, are patient view, order select, and order sign.
Exactly.
I bet it was those 3.
Yeah, and that's the ordering workflow. Clearly, there's a lot of opportunity to help clinicians, right? As part of to provide additional information to clinicians as part of that workflow. And then everybody likes patient view just because it's the kind of most generic and easiest to think about, and like, oh, every use case applies to patient view. And so those are the ones that we've matured, that have the highest maturity level based upon our CDS Hooks kind of maturity model.
So kind of along that line, I have a follow-up question for you, which is that the CDS Hooks approved, at least to my understanding, the CDS approved standard has a certain set of CDS Hooks, and then there's also a continuous improvement build.
Right.
And the continuous improvement build, what is the process for that to become an asserted standard approved as opposed to just continuous improvement?
So that's a great question. And so we call it, within the base CDS Hook specification is the section that we call it, there's a section called Hook Maturity Model. And this is very much kind of just stolen from the Fire. Fire does something
very similar.
Very similar, right?
Yeah.
Where then the basic idea, the philosophy here is interoperable standards get better as they're used.
As they're
And
implemented, tested.
yeah, as they're implemented and tested, as they come into contact with real world clinicians, and as well as just developers. It's not something that we're kind of designing by ourselves. Rather, this is something that we're kind of collaborating with as large of a community as possible, and taking feedback from that entire community. And anyone, literally anyone in the world can propose a new CDS hooks hook. They just write a description and they submit kind of a change request, submit a GitHub pull request on the internet that describes that hook, and then that hook is kind of accepted and published as part of that kind of continuous integration, that build version of the spec. And then in order to mature that hook over time into higher and higher levels of maturity, published objective defined maturity that have defined criteria, that hook has to be used. First, we expect it to be kind of prototyped by developers, and then tested between developers who have kind of independent implementations in multiple countries. And then and also the FHIR community is really great at, this is kind of some of the underlying philosophy of the FHIR community overall, which is it's important to come together and test independent implementations. And I think you guys might be familiar with that concept of a connectathon, which is those developer facing events where developers do exactly that. And then we also have a couple of other requirements of production usage, certain numbers by a certain number of vendors. And then also lastly, the HL7 itself ballots that material at a certain kind of maturity level that they call normative, which means we won't make backward compatibility breaking changes. So that's the whole kind of maturity model for CDS hooks.
Just to interpret that a little bit more detail. So some of the other hooks that are listed in the continuous improvement build that are still listed as 1, those get reviewed fairly regularly, or at least like once a year or something?
Yeah, the last time we did it, right, exactly. So the last time we did it, we went through a maturity ballot actually just last year.
Okay.
And did publish. So and did republish all of the hooks at their new evaluated maturity level. And that's in order to do that, well, a lot of that is just kind of us soliciting feedback from the implementation community, from developers who are writing software that uses CDS hooks, like organizations that might be using CDS hooks as an integration technology themselves. We say hey, how many of you are using this hook? And are you doing it in multiple countries? And how many sites do you think you have live with that? And so we do have a lot of ones, yeah. So I was just pulling that up again, right? And so I think we're going to continue to do that kind of periodically. I think probably annually is a good cadence, where we kind of go in and officially reevaluate the maturity based upon our objective criteria, and then republish the maturity of hooks over time.
And I think that's fascinating. In IHE, we have a very, very similar model as in DICOM as well. But it's interesting to see that the list of hooks itself is also growing.
Right.
That tells me that people are still working on this, and they're paying attention and coming up with the new use cases. Right.
We actually just, I don't know, within the past, over the past couple of months, we actually worked to republish the CDS hook specification just in the typical FHIR IG format. And so now it looks more like a FHIR spec. And we published it actually as 2 different specifications. So as the base CDS hook specification, and then also as a second specification that's just the hook library. And we did that because over time, while the CDS hooks base specification, at some point, we're going to stop making changes to it. HL7 is going to identify it as normative, and it's going to be more or less kind of stable. And that's a good thing. That means that implementers will be able to depend on it and won't need to fear backward compatibility changes. Whereas our hook library, I think the best case scenario here is that the number of hooks here will just grow forever as medicine advances, as science advances, as health IT advances. We'll have more and more workflow steps that the community can standardize on. And then this library will just kind of keep getting bigger forever. And so because of that difference in those two different specifications, that we actually made them two different fire IGs that are just kind of highly related.
Krishnaj, we probably have time for one more question.
I was very fascinated. I was fascinated to look at the library. For example, a couple of things I picked up. One was medication refill, hook for medication refill. That's probably unique as I was thinking about it. Like providers usually do not put an order for a refill every time. I would write for 10 refills for, let's say, medication. But perhaps there is a use case of knowing when is the patient actually refilling, or more importantly, the medication was not refilled. So it's pretty fascinating to see. And
Yeah.
I don't have you seen use cases like that, or have people come to you as use cases like that, and that's the genesis of these kind of library, these kind of
Yes.
hooks?
Yeah. And part of one of the requirements for a new hook is that you describe at least one workflow in which that hook can be used. And so and this particular the med refill hook actually came about because that was something that came about from Epic's use of certain workflow steps that we were triggering remote CDS as part of. And so the use case here is actually for some, I don't know, sir, you know better than I. For some medications, the refill protocol is just kind of complicated and detailed. It's like, well, like when as a clinician, as a prescriber, refilling this medication, what are the for how many days should I refill this medication, given that it's the third refill? Or I mean, there's a kind of specific medication refill protocols that can just be a lot of details, I think, to keep in someone's head. And there are services from decision support vendors that are intended to just kind of help alleviate a little bit of that kind of mental load by jumping in at the moment of ordering that med refill, in order to give a little bit of guidance in terms of, oh, hey, for this medication, here's the recommended protocol given all the clinical details. But we haven't, so that's a note that medication refill hook is one of the ones, as Teri pointed out, at level 1. And that's because we haven't really seen organizations kind of use it beyond, or don't have evidence that organizations are using it very widely yet. But I think there's a lot of opportunity there. It's a pretty targeted into that specific use cases of refill protocols. But I think that the creativity of the community means that there's opportunity for other use cases as well.
Can I have a follow-on question to that?
Yeah,
because
please.
It's very interesting, because one of the largest, and it's not unique to our healthcare system, many healthcare systems, largest reasons for readmissions or something bad happening is patient did not get the antibiotic after discharge. So is this, and what you described was mostly provider facing, as I understood, is that the provider is ordering a refill.
Mm-hmm.
But have you seen, or do you see a use case of CDS hooks being used by pharmacy or pharmacy providers to see whether a medication was refilled or not, and then probably feed that information back?
I know that there have been some like early, I don't know, brainstorming or design discussions around, I think it was the medication verify workflow step performed by the pharmacist. There was the idea that could and that should be a CDS hook. I don't really remember where that is what the current state is. But definitely, I think a pharmacist workflow. Really, it's any clinician's workflow step, and even with the kind of the payer provider stuff, we're even going beyond just clinical users to administrative users, and then there's also always been a lot of conversation about, well, which of these are applicable to kind of patient workflows? Like, why can't we be delivering clinical decision support
Exactly.
to the patient within their portal, within their app? And really, CDS Hooks defines this framework that's reusable in all of those different scenarios, and you can just plug in those little the hooks, and as we develop new hooks over time, and I think there's a lot of use cases that can be satisfied here.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. I mean, this is so exciting. Sorry, just like to have a CDS hook, let's say, in the provider side, and then let's say the pharmacy IT side, then the patient side. I mean, we can really have a workflow that is it gives complete visibility about where antibiotic was refilled or not, or was it filled to the appropriate manner in an appropriate manner, so on and so forth. Thank you. No, this is exciting.
Good. Yeah.
And also for the patient view to be able to provide the right information if they have certain questions on because they have certain conditions. You could do a fire query and you can get that condition. You could provide the right information right there. It may eliminate some of the Dr. Google information which comes up. Thank you so much for taking the time out today, Isaac. We really appreciate it. We are incredibly grateful for all the work that you've done on CDS Hooks. We feel it is our responsibility to kind of carry this forward to all of our students who are going to be our leaders in the industry and hopefully the developers, so that we can really help with getting CDS Hooks out into the real world.
Great.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.